Hi, historians. This lecture is called For the Want of an Eye, How Phoenix Became the Capital, or Arizona's Territorial Politics in the Age of Mining. So as Marshall Trimble once said, Congress, quote, didn't fall all over itself welcoming Arizona into the Union in the early 1860s. At the time, the 1860 census counted fewer than 2,500 non-Indians in the Arizona Territory. And the major complaint was that there, quote, weren't enough people, meaning white male landowners, to warrant territorial status. So how did Arizona become a state is our question over the course of the next couple of lessons. But we're going to figure out today first how Phoenix became the capital. So the state's mineral wealth was attractive to the Union, who wanted to claim the territory in an effort to financially beat the South. The two largest mining operations in Arizona were owned by Ohio politicians and businessmen, and in an effort to convince Congress to pass the Organic Act of 1862, Ohio man James Ashley displayed a mammoth chunk of silver in Congress. The demonstration won the day, and Arizona was admitted as a territory. We've talked before about how Arizona was already a territory, sort of, at least 3 times previously. The first time was in 1860, when Arizonans essentially proclaimed themselves a territory, but nobody paid any attention. The second time was when the Confederate Congress claimed it 2 years later, but as did the Union's General James Carleton. But all of these attempts called for a line dividing the territory of New Mexico along the 24th parallel. This meant that Arizona and New Mexico would have been split horizontally instead of vertically. However, New Mexicans preferred a different split, one in which they would keep the rich Mesilla Valley and give the expansive Apache land further west to Arizona. So let's look at a couple different maps. Ashley's bill, the Ohio man from 1862, called for a line running south from the west boundary of Colorado Territory, see right here, called the Four Corners. At the time, this was called the Four Corners, to the Mexican border. So Arizonans then took on a new shape right here. It had been here, and now it's here. After a long fight in Congress, Lincoln signed the statute, and Arizona was proclaimed a Union territory in the midst of the Civil War. These are the fathers, self-proclaimed fathers of Arizona. And so the slide is titled Fathers of Arizona, or How Self-Promotion Gets a Street Named After You. The first territorial governor appointed was Ohio Congressman James Gurley. If you've ever been to Prescott, there's a street in downtown called Gurley Street. He died before taking office, and another ex-congressman, James Goodwin of Maine, took office. Perhaps the most significant appointee, however, was Charles Poston, who served as superintendent of Indian Affairs. He would come to shape our state's history. He was the first superintendent of Indian Affairs, and then second delegate to Congress. He's perhaps the person who was most persuasive in convincing Congress to admit Arizona as a new territory, though his nickname, Father of Arizona, is due to his own self-promotion. Choosing a capital. Do you pronounce it Prescott or Prescott? The assumption was that the capital would be Tucson. It was the only community that could actually claim to be a community. But any of you out there have any guesses as to why Tucson did not become the capital in a Union territory? Any guesses? Because it was already affiliated with the Confederate cause. Also, gold had recently been discovered in the Bradshaw Mountains, so a temporary capital was established near what is today Prescott, Arizona. The town got its name from an author of the classic history of Mexico, William Hickling Prescott, but his name was pronounced Prescott, whose work helped the new politicians navigate what was once Mexico's northern frontier. Prescott, which locals eventually took to calling Prescott, was a crude town in the old days. One of the only buildings in town was called Fort Misery, which offered room and board to miners if payment of gold was only made in advance. Fort Misery also moonlighted as the town's only church. If you've ever been up to Prescott, Whiskey Row is one of the best known landmarks in our state. It's probably one of Arizona's best known streets. Around the turn of the century, as the capital grew, Montezuma Street, offering 40 saloons, some of which are still standing today, became the center of nightlife in Arizona. But our state was still in territorial limbo. A year after Arizona became a territory, 4,573 non-Indians claimed residency. 6 years later, the population had grown to 9,658. All were Hispanic or Anglo, except 26 Blacks and 20 Chinese. By 1880, the population exploded, mostly due to mining. Arizona was a territory for 62 years. Texas and California never officially even went through territory status. That's how slow and timid Congress was about admitting our state, which seemed to them like a wasteland of both resources and small white populations. But during its territorial years, Arizona was the least known and least populated region in the entire nation. Though the territory began pushing for statehood in 1872, outlaws, Indian wars, and lack of good roads were primary factors in delaying statehood. Territorial status meant that Arizonans were without a vote. They could send delegates to Congress, but they couldn't participate in any national election. Their legislature could pass laws, but they were subject to review in Washington. Congress controlled all finances and could take land or resources away if they chose. All highest-ranking officers were appointed by the president, since the Republicans were in power at the end of the Civil War, all appointed officials were members of the GOP, beginning our state's long affiliation with the Republican Party. The Thieving 13th, or today we might not like our politicians, but at least no one throws dead cats at them yet. Let's talk about one of the most interesting sessions in Arizona territorial history, the 13th session in Prescott in 1885. The citizens of Tucson raised a satchel full of money and told their delegates to bring home the capital and that nothing else would be accepted. Meanwhile, other delegates were getting ready to play their own card. Pinal County wanted a bridge across the Gila River, while the northern part of Cochise wanted to secede from the territory. In Maricopa, Tempe wanted a normal school, which is a university for teachers, while Phoenix wanted an insane asylum. Tucson wanted the capital, but so did Prescott. Mother Nature, as she often does, intervened. A flood on the Salt River forced the Pima County delegates to travel by train, and at Maricopa to Los Angeles, then back to Ashford. This was 50 miles north of Prescott, and then they were supposed to take a stage back to the capital. But a snowstorm held up the stage at Hell's Canyon. So one of the delegates, Bob Leatherford, took this satchel of money and rolled a mule into Prescott. By the time the ride was over, all political trades had already been made and prizes handed out. Prescott remained the capital. Cochise was stuck in the territory for another session. A bridge in Florence was approved. Tempe got its school, and Phoenix got its asylum. When the delegates realized that Tucson had been left, they awarded the city of Tucson with the only thing they had left on the table, a university. What do we want with a university? Cried Leatherwood, who owned the saloon. Students don't drink. Angry citizens of Tucson, when faced with the news, hurled rotten eggs and tomatoes at their delegates. One even threw a dead cat. They had sent these politicians with over 4,000 public funds and a satchel of money, and these men had returned to Tucson with nothing that attracted the voters. Phoenix, or for the want of an eye. So how did Phoenix become the capital when Tucson and Prescott were fighting for it? It's actually a really interesting story. During the 15th legislature, the capital was up for grabs once again. A recent upstart city on the banks of the Salt River, Phoenix, was making a play. Maricopa County delegates made a deal with a certain lady of the evening called Kissin Jenny. Their goal was to have Jenny distract and detain one of the legislators from Yavapai County, which would cause him to miss the vote, which would likely be cast for Prescott. The man in question wore a glass eye. This was 1889, so a glass eye would have been highly unusual and very, very expensive. It was the only one in the territory, and he was quite proud of it. He would never go anywhere without it, and held his eye as a point of pride, no pun intended. He was also known for his specific amorous proclivity towards Kissin Jenny. One night after the assembly convened, the Prescott delegate headed over to Kissin Jenny's place for some evening entertainment. Legend has it that after the frolic with Jenny, he placed his glass eye in a water glass next to the bed and went to sleep. Jenny, finding thirst, reached over and drank the contents of the glass, eye and all. The next morning, the delegate woke and couldn't, quote, see his eye in the water glass. He freaked out and refused to go out in public without his glass eye. This meant he would miss the territorial capital vote. His buddies knew he was missing, and they figured that he was at Jenny's sleeping in. They headed over to her place, and upon discovering why he wouldn't come out, they tried to force her to produce the eye. She wouldn't or couldn't help them. In their laser-focused panic, they were too distracted that not just one, but most of the Yavapai delegates were thus missing from the vote, which allowed for the 1889 determination of Phoenix, which people called, quote, way out east, to win the county seat. It took Arizonans about 60 years to become a state, but not for a lack of trying. Their first attempt was in 1891 when Congress laughed them back to the desert. White and Hispanic Arizonans first volunteered in droves for the Spanish-American War in 1898, hoping to cull favor for statehood. The first time Congress took it seriously was when, once again, an option for joint statehood with New Mexico was proposed in 1903, but Arizona voted against it, mostly due to the white leadership of the Ohio businessmen in the Grand Canyon state and their outright disdain for Mexicans and Native Americans. As we've covered before, they lost their shot at being the 47th state when they pissed off President Taft with their judges recall clause in the Constitution, which they just added back in after statehood was granted in 1912 anyway. But by then, Phoenix had long been the capital and was on its way to becoming the mega metropolis that it is today. We will explore Phoenix's growth in the coming weeks.